Hello, thank you so much for joining today's conversation on mobilizing faith communities to push for youth justice reform. It's Joshua Gordon with the National Juvenile Justice Network, and we are happy to have you here. A little bit about our presenters today. Our first one is NJJN member, Reverend Dr. Dietra Baker, and she's the program coordinator for Advocacy and Activism with the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church. In this role, she nurtures engagement strategies with the NBA to transform root causes of social injustice. This includes equipping and training partners to address the critical social justice issues most relevant to their work, and collaborating with NBA staff to cultivate partnerships across the life of the church to coordinate efforts related to social justice theology, action, and advocacy. Dr. Dietra is a community organizer with Gamaliel Network's Metropolitan Congregations United, and she led the Break the Pipeline campaign, aiming to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline in Missouri. In August 2014, she was a caucus co-leader of resource clergy and congregations in the early stages of the Ferguson movement. Our next speaker who's joining us today is Kate Trammell. Kate serves Prison Fellowship as the Senior State Campaign Manager, overseeing state policy campaigns on criminal justice and juvenile justice reform. While coordinating with state coalition partners and policymakers, Trammell plans and supervises legislative research in support of federal and state advocacy priorities. She serves as primary facilitator of the Faith and Justice Fellowship, a bipartisan body of members of Congress, governors, and state legislators motivated by their faith traditions to advance restorative values in criminal justice reform. Prior to joining Prison Fellowship, Kate Trammell worked as a magistrate for the Supreme Court of Virginia. She is a graduate of the Liberty University School of Law and a member of the Virginia Bar. Trammell has contributed to stories about criminal justice reform in outlets including Business Insider and Christianity Today. So let's get on with the conversation.
One of my biggest joys has been engaging the church specifically in youth justice reform. I believe so deeply that how we address youth crime is a strategic moment in the lives of young people, in the lives of communities, and also a key decision-making point for our policymakers, and the church plays such a vital role in that.
That's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And getting to our first question, let's start with the positive. So what are advantages to partnering with faith communities on youth justice reform? Dietra, we'll start with you.
Sure. I'll name some obvious things. Churches obviously have a rich spiritual tradition and resources, prayer, pastoral care, a lot of strength and power. And then there's a lot of untapped resources, like people in buildings. A lot of people in the church have amazing gifts. You have to kind of get in there to deep just to see how many gifts there are. For example, we meet in a local synagogue, and we meet in that building for free. I think another thing that's important is that there's some moral imperatives and some moral narratives that the faith community provides that I think is still relevant in most communities, that draw people together and connect them. And so it can be kind of a common language, a common narrative that can draw people together across race and ethnicity and economic background around faith. And then I would say particularly for the Black church, which is the church that I've been mostly formed by, is that it was birthed as a reform movement. I mean, it literally is a resistance to oppression and racism in its formation. That being said, it makes it kind of a natural place where folks that are oppressed, young people that are dealing kind of with the systemic racism that's imbued in many of the systems that they have to interact with and their families have to interact with, they can find fellowship, companionship, resistance, and resilience in communities of color, who in their very existence were birthed for that. And so those are some of the resources I think that faith communities offer.
Thank you, Dietra. I appreciate that. And Kate, how about you? What are some advantages you've seen to partnering with faith communities on youth justice reform?
Well, there are so many, and Dietra hit very nicely on many of them, so I'll limit it to about 3 from my perspective. I think, first of all, faith leaders in communities tend to be very trusted voices of moral guidance, both for the neighborhood at large, and then also for policymakers who are trying to discern where communities of faith may stand on an issue, and it can be very influential and strategic in that way. They're sort of a natural guiding signal of where values are that should lead public policy. And then second, I think Dietra hit on this as well, that the church is sort of a cornerstone of the neighborhood in many ways in a lot of communities, or most communities, particularly in rural areas. And it's often the church that provides that infrastructure of programming traditionally, engaging young people, engaging parents and communities, providing outreach resources to people in need. And I think that provides a nice picture and baseline, if you will, for how community intervention and accountability models can be fleshed out, particularly as advocates like myself are working towards reform of the justice system to decrease reliance on incarceration, right? As we do that, we're looking to bulk up community resources and intervention models, mentoring, other resources like that, where the church is a natural fit. And then my last point would just be redemption is a key value understood by the Christian. The concept of a second chance is familiar. It's not something new. And so the values that underlie or undergird the reasons for youth justice reform are often resonant already within the church body.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that, Kate. And we're going to stick with you for our third question, and we're going to do the other side of the coin. So could you talk about some common challenges you've met when working and mobilizing faith communities, and how advocates can overcome them, and then also put a conservative spin on that, as opposed to conservative organizations and communities you've reached out to?
Sure. So Prison Fellowship has been engaging the church on issues of crime and incarceration for about 40 years now. Our founder, Chuck Colson, had a legacy of really drawing people together, and was the first of the set of unlikely allies that we read about in the news now on justice reform issues from the conservative side. So our niche is often, though we're a nonpartisan organization, reaching out to those faith communities that lean more conservative on social issues, because that's where our values and our legacy put us as well. There are some challenges inherent in that. I think one of the most frequent challenges that I have faced in engaging the church is understanding how to maneuver within the structure of a church, as opposed to a typical coalition partner that's already engaging in the effort at some level. I think it's important to put in the time and to meet churches where they are, to understand their place in the community and their values, and approach them, offering them an opportunity to be a voice for the values they already believe in on an issue that they may not have touched on before, particularly in the more conservative church environment. I think it's also sometimes a challenge to engage churches specifically in supporting active legislation. And there can be a bit of hesitation in endorsing things that can feel like lobbying, specific bills and things like that. And so I think there are some unique approaches that you can take to offer the church a way to voice their values in statements of principle, in speaking to the issue at large, rather than asking them to sign on a letter that states support for a specific bill. And that has the kind of dual purpose as well of giving you a living document that can be useful over and over, because it's reflective of enduring values instead of a bill that may or may not be successful during that particular legislative session. And then I think finally, it's important to manage expectations of who can engage and when. I think when people seek to engage the church on an issue, they often think, I'm going to be on the phone with the lead pastor and working with him to speak to these issues publicly, and sometimes that's the case. But I think it's important to be respectful and understanding that pastors are very, very busy people who have a lot on their plates and may be willing to engage and ready to engage, but may be more strategic and helpful to resource someone in the church body who can coordinate with the pastor on how to work through those things, how to engage more deeply.
Great, thank you, Kate. And I'm going to toss it back over to you, Dr. Dietra. If you could talk about some common challenges you've met when working to mobilize faith communities and how you've overcome them.
Sure. Kate has covered some of them, but I'll say this from a most of the churches that we engage with, or I would say from the moderate to the liberal side of the faith traditions. That being said, some of the issues are the same. One, folks are very busy. Folks are very busy. But one of the ways that we've overcome some of the busyness is a couple of things. One of them is that our organization in particular, but lots of folks engage lay folks. Lay folks can be very powerful. I don't say they have necessarily more time, but they're generally a little bit more available, and there's more of them than just the kind of pastoral leader model. And so most of the folks that get stuff done in our organization are the lay folks. So we try to be intentional about engaging them and giving them different levels of engagement. It seems to work best with churches to kind of keep the campaigns or to keep them kind of short and sweet, because churches, as you know, have lots of things going on internally, and so it's kind of hard sometimes to get a very long-term commitment out of the life of the church. One of the things that we do is we go in and we actually build core teams of people, and you might find in some moderate and progressive churches that they already have these teams built. Social justice committees or social outreach committees that are already sort of poised and ready to reach out. And one of the challenges a lot of times with the groups is they're very passionate. They may have 50 justice issues that they're working on. So you coming in with kind of the youth justice, they're working on environmental stuff, they're working on anti-racism stuff. You know, they have a few things that they're working at. Even very small churches will oftentimes have 4 or 5 different issues that they're working on. And so campaigns and work that helps them already do some of the activities that they need to do helps. For example, we're getting ready to do a Get Out the Vote campaign in our community, and we're going to churches to ask them to do it. But we're asking them to canvass their own neighborhoods. And a lot of the folks in the church, they need to get out and meet people in their neighborhood anyway, so that they'll know that the church is there, so they can build a relationship with folks in their community. And so we try not to ask them to do extra things. They got a lot of things on their list already. They have enough meetings. The pastors have enough meetings. We try to help create strategies and tactics that are going to help them do some things and complete some disciplines they need to complete as a church anyway. And so that we're not actually asking them to do something extra.
That's super helpful. I appreciate it, Dr. Dietra. And just to let the audience know that we want this conversation to be engaging. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type those in now. Also, we have about one more question left for our presenters, and then we want to hear from you. Have you come across any problems or opportunities in engaging with faith communities, or do you have any questions specific to the work of Kate or Dr. Dietra? And so we'll stay with you, Dr. Dietra, for our last question before we open it up to the audience. And we've already talked about some ways that advocates can effectively partner with faith communities, but I want to stay on that for a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about how you've made the case for youth justice reform to faith communities? What does that effective messaging look like, or even like what types of tools have you used to reach out to faith leaders or lay people?
Mm-hmm. Sure. In faith communities, there's, and depending on the faith community, so in our particular organization, we have interfaith leaders, so we go across faith groups. There's ecumenical resources, so there's cross-denomination, and then we also partner with folks who don't believe what we believe, but belong to the values that we belong to. And so there are people there that would not claim faith, call themselves agnostic, but really are concerned about human dignity and the respect of our young people. So I would say it's really been about building a narrative, a comparative narrative about what we generally say we want for children. And when you talk to the common person in the church, they have a really good picture of what we want for our kids and the values and the vision that we want for our kids. And we generally, because we do, we lead a campaign on ending the criminalization of Black youth, then we hold up what is the narrative about Black youth, how are Black youth treated, what do people say about them, and really begin to help people see the difference in those narratives. And that's sort of enough to get people a little angry, a little agitated, a little ready to do something. So that's sort of our beginning point, is to get people to think about what do they want for their own children? What does God say about children? What does God say about, and if you're not a person of faith, what are our common values about what we want for our community and our youth? And that's enough to prime the pump to get folks started.
Great, that's awesome. Thank you for that information. So going back to you, Kate, how about you? How have you effectively partnered with faith communities? What does that messaging look like, and how have you made the case?
Sure. Well, we're blessed to have strong partnerships with lots of folks in the faith community. Some of them with churches who participate in our Angel Tree program, which serves communities around churches by personally providing kids who have an incarcerated parent with a Christmas gift, and then an invitation to join them for worship, and creates that connection ultimately between a family who's experiencing the effects of incarceration in their local church body. So we have those churches who participate in the Angel Tree program and serve about 300,000 kids every year, and growing. And that's a great foundational resource for our church partnerships. But we also have, as Dietra mentioned, she does some partnerships on a larger scale with the National Association of Evangelicals, with the Ethics and Religious Liberties Convention of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Colson Center on Christian Worldview, and others who we consistently dialogue with and partner with on not just how to engage the church in practical ways, although we do cover that, but how to reflect biblical values that we adhere to on issues of justice, and make sure that what we're presenting to churches is theologically sound and is something that would be appealing, and that we're not creating tools that they won't use. And so I think in terms of messaging, one of the key places that I always start is by sort of plumbing the depths of what does it mean that each person is created in the image of God, by God, with inherent dignity and value, and how does that inform how we treat them in terms of justice? The Bible speaks to punishment being proportional to the opportunity for earning back trust and gaining a second chance. And I think each of those things can be the start of a very strong dialogue about the values that should inform our actions, and being consistent in the way that we apply those values across the board, even to issues that feel risky or unpopular, which is sometimes the feedback that I get on issues regarding crime and incarceration from churches that haven't traditionally engaged in the topic. As far as tools, because Prison Fellowship has been partnering with churches for such a long time, we've been privileged to have the opportunity to spend some time thinking about how best to engage our church audiences, and have created a couple of tools that are unique and interesting and that have had some success. And so I'd like to share just about a couple of those with you all to get your wheels spinning as well for ways that you could engage churches that you're working with. The first is the Justice Declaration. We launched this project last year in the summer with the partnership of NAE and the ERLC and the Colson Center. And essentially, it's a not very long statement about 10 principles that reflect a biblical position according to these organizations that have come together, and that's been vetted by theologians, on what the Bible says about crime and incarceration, how it should inform prison ministry, the call to advocacy, youth justice and adult justice concerns. We also have launched Second Chance Month. We are in our second year of this campaign, and the goal of this campaign is to celebrate April every year as Second Chance Month across partisan lines, across denominational lines. And one particular way that we seek to engage the church is through this project by providing a specific toolkit created for churches to be able to have what's called a Second Chance Sunday. So that includes things like model bulletins, coloring sheets for kids who are in children's church, and sermon outlines if those are useful to pastors, and a whole host of other things that churches can use to make sure that they're speaking about these issues that can be difficult. We also have Outrageous Justice, which is a small group study guide curriculum for churches. And this is kind of geared at the concept that sometimes the most fruitful dialogue comes from those dialogues. And so we're seeking to engage the church by offering them a tool that hopefully they already want to use, which is to have a Bible study curriculum talking about justice concerns and offering ways to engage in their communities and apply those values. So those are a couple of the projects that we have to engage the church. There are many more. Those are just some that I have found really useful and exciting, and would love to have you all engage with us in those as well.
Great, thank you. Those sound like some great resources. And just so folks know, I will be sending around the resources that are mentioned today. And so be on the lookout in your inbox for those. And we have our first question from the audience. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, type it into the question box, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask it directly. This question comes from John Kelly, and he's wondering if you have seen any faith-based juvenile justice programs around the country that have really impressed you in terms of outcomes. Dr. Dietra, could you answer that?
I would say there's a few. We would be one of them, but I'll give you some sources for some other folks that you could find. There's a group of faith-based organizing networks, and they're generally in every community. The three big major ones would be the Gamel Network, PICO Network, and IAF. And generally what you will find among those, one is a group of churches or other faith-based communities that are gathering around purposes of reform and justice in some shape. They work on all kinds of justice issues, but you will find among them definitely criminal justice reform, and sometimes you will find among them youth justice platforms. And so here in St. Louis, Metropolitan Congregations United for the last 4 years has had the Break the Pipeline campaign. It's completely focused on youth justice. It organizes reforms around school discipline, policing, and juvenile courts. We've been able to get rid of K through third grade suspensions in our region. We've been able to begin to implement memorandums of understanding between school resource officers and our districts about how they ensue discipline. We built a robust relationship with our county juvenile courts to make sure the voices of parents and youth are at the center of their reform work. And so I know we're not original. And so I would encourage you to look to those networks in your area. Some of these things are kind of hidden in the community.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I appreciate those. And we'll try and get a couple of those resources to the audience afterwards, some links and tools for you. But I'll pose the question to you as well, Kate. Have you seen some impressive outcomes from faith-based juvenile justice programs?
Sure. So, I think my answer is really tailored again towards the local church involvement. From where I sit and the organizations that I work with, the communities that I work with, I think the most powerful and sometimes overlooked resource for youth justice campaigns is just that local church body who's already ministering in local detention centers and others. So I was recently with a group of pastors in Alabama talking about the youth justice reforms that have been progressing there and unfortunately have stopped for this year. But we were sitting around a table discussing how their church overlaps with the youth justice system, and talking through things like their youth group participation and the families in their church body who are encountering this. But the churches that were most effective in addressing youth justice concerns that I've spoken with are ones that have that in-prison ministry component, that already kind of get it and care and understand the issues. And I think it's really a matter of, it's easiest to love someone well when you have proximity to them. So it's easiest to embrace your values and put those on display and in action on loving people who are affected by crime and incarceration, being there for kids who are justice involved, if you are actually in relationship with them already. So those churches who have programs to reach people behind bars are often the most effective, in my experience, at advocating for justice reform, because it's real to them.
That's good. Thank you.
Josh,
And
I would
again,
just add this resource real quick, and Kate probably knows, Straight Ahead Ministries, Dr. Scott Larson in the Boston area. I mean, they've just done some great things in terms of youth ministry, and in collaboration with the community, they've been able to move those learnings from youth incarceration and ministry to some broader models for youth justice in the Boston area. So I would look up Straight Ahead Ministries and their coalition partners to look at some of the work that they've done.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dietra. They're such a strong partner and have a lot of relationships nationally and programs nationally as well in different spots that are super effective.
there are a lot of great resources. I'm feverishly writing them down. I really appreciate it. We've talked a lot about partnership, and so I'm thinking in terms of outreach to someone you may not know, or do you have certain criteria for how you reach out to partners, and what does that process look like for either? Let's start with you, Kate.
Sure. So I think it depends on how we're seeking to engage them. When I go into a state and I'm looking to engage members of local faith communities on youth justice, I find that it's less about criteria that a pastor or a church needs to meet in order to be included in that discussion than it is a matter of my planning and structure to make sure that I'm engaging them early and often, and having real fruitful discussions. I think particularly as a national group that works in several states and is not always resourced with state-specific staff, what I seek to avoid is the model of flying in, imposing my view and my values on the local community and then leaving. And so I think there's a real accountability measure there within your own team and your own sort of strategic plan of how to engage the church, if you have one, that should encourage you to have real conversations and ask pastors and churches what they're seeing as the impact of incarceration on their community, how they would like to engage, and then resourcing them from there. So I think the best advice that I have is just, as you're creating new partnerships, listen, ask open-ended questions, and then be prepared to take time to craft solutions.
That's good. Thank you. And Dietra, how about you? Any criteria or best practices you have for reaching out to folks?
I think one part sort of foundational is just that if you have staff, that you dedicate staff or volunteers to build long-term investment in the faith community. So it doesn't really work well, particularly with faith communities, to kind of be in and out. You sort of have to kind of commit up front that we're going to have a faith community engagement strategy over a period of time, that we're going to deeply invest in the leaders that come from these communities, and that we're going to build long-term relationships. So I would say if you're sort of not there, it'll be hard to kind of hold on to the faith communities, because you'll have to keep engaging and keep connecting and keep building relationships. And so there has to be quite, I would say, an investment to want to stick in there for the long haul. In terms of some kind of quick, quick and dirty ways to kind of get in contact. There are denominations, there's conferences. When we were in Memphis, I was at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor conference, and I saw a notice about an action that was happening. I was able to engage the conference speakers and get 40 or so folks to come to an action that was literally like a block away from where we were. And so there's lots of conferences where you can meet leaders when they're more in a mode sort of with what to do next. So they're being reflective. They're sort of not at home kind of doing their daily stuff. So conferences is a great place to interact and connect with leaders. Engaging your local clergy coalitions. They're pretty much in every city. And so try to find out those coalitions, those partnerships. Usually there's several different kinds of coalitions. So make sure you're getting a diversity of partners and of leaders in the community as you engage those groups. And then the adjudicatory leaders. Usually in every state, there's leaders who manage the church bodies or the faith communities. They know all the pastors, they know all the leaders, they know all the churches. Sometimes it's quicker and maybe better to engage those adjudicatory leaders, and who could tell you these are some of the churches you should reach out to, or the faith communities you should reach out to, that would kind of be a warm reception for the kind of thing that you're saying you're called to do.
Great. Let's take a question from the audience, and we have one from Sheila Turner. Sheila, I've unmuted you, so you can ask your question now.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, so most of the churches that I'm familiar with have prison ministries that focus on adults, and usually their engagement stops there. They don't expand into the juvenile offender area. So what are some like baby steps or beginning steps that you can recommend to encourage churches to expand into advocacy and include juveniles in the conversation?
Great question. Kate, could you take that for us, and then we'll hear from Dr. Dietra.
Sure. So I love that question because, man, I encounter that all the time. And I think it's great, first of all, that those churches that you're interacting with have a prison ministry program. And that's kind of a leg up on many churches who I interact with who have no engagement with the justice system at all, or don't recognize that their congregants do. I think the transition from focusing solely on adult incarceration and crime and moving that to young people is not as tough of a pivot as it may feel. I think many churches, certainly many of the churches who I interact with, understand the impact of reaching young people. They prioritize reaching young people with the gospel, with their values. They have robust children's ministries programs, youth groups, all of that. So they have the strategic understanding that young people are valuable, that they're worthwhile, that families should be strong, and that there may be a unique way to address young people or a tailored message to young people that's a little bit different than adults. So I think that provides a natural platform to express the same circumstance with prison ministry and to also, I think, inform them of the differences. So there are those great similarities of values, of strategy, of impact with the ministry piece that they're already conducting with reaching youth. But I think it's important to also be someone who can advise them on differences in the youth justice system. There are a lot of just practical differences in the way the system functions from adults. And the length of time that someone is incarcerated is different. The way that looks, hopefully, is different. And so I think just making yourself available to answer questions and to sort of provide that bridge is the best thing that you can do.
How about you, Dietra?
Sure. There was a couple of things that helped. One, we started going into the community and being part of the community conversations about mass incarceration, and we would lift up the juvenile justice system as a feeder system to the adult system. And what we found locally, and I think this is true, is that because of sort of the confidentiality that kind of shrouds juvenile detention centers and those processes, a lot of people like literally don't even know where the juvenile detention center is. Like, you know, people are sort of they lock kids up, and they don't realize that yes, kids are incarcerated. And so one of the things that we did and we do is we bring people inside the center. We partner with some local organizations to get in, to do tours, to do programs with the kids on the inside. That helps churches see what's going on and what this place is like and what's happening to these children. Sometimes we've had the great misfortune of servicing impacted families that were right in their own congregation. We know generally, particular for people of color, that the youth are there. The youth and families are being impacted are there in these churches, and they may be ashamed or afraid to share this information with the pastor or other people that are in the community. And so we've tried to create teach-ins and youth Sundays where we have incorporated spaces for youth to know that they're valued and that God's never going to throw them away, so that families can get rid of the shroud a little bit of shame and then begin to share with their pastors and their leaders what's really going on. And that generally kind of the veil has to be taken away for faith members to get involved. But those are some of the things that we've done, is to have teach-ins and youth Sundays to build those relationships and help people understand that the detention center is there.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I hope that was helpful for you, Sheila. We have a couple more minutes before we wrap up, but we have a question from Frank Crawford. And Frank, I just unmuted you so you can ask your question directly.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. So this is like a part B to the question that was just asked. So I'm finding that, or I'm hearing often that the obstacles with engaging the faith community are not problems with the faith community. You can talk to churches and get them engaged in kids and the values of kids and how important they are and how the biblical things and all that. The challenges, the obstacles are more so with the system, around confidentiality, around liability issues, around background checks and that, and the public agencies that deal with these kids that desperately would like volunteers involved. Those agencies don't have the capacity to manage all of those issues. Have you got any experience on how communities have addressed that in the past, or in successful situations where maybe they've overcome some of those obstacles?
Anyone jump in and answer that? Anyone? Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I would say in my last job, I was that person who was coordinating and getting background checks done for faith communities that want to come in. And a lot of times I could tell you that the people coming in would kind of lose their fervor as they would be waiting to get approved. And so we advocated in the system, one, for the importance and the resources that communities could provide, and to help the system understand, this is a resource. And so we literally got that process, the time for that process kind of cut down, and asked the system to get some folks who were in charge of that, so that faith folks wouldn't lose their fervor while they were waiting 6 months to a year to get approved to come in to those systems. But then I also would say that this again would be important, just as faith communities need long-term investment. These systems need long-term investment by faith communities. So faith communities have to be serious about engaging these young people in these systems. This is definitely not like a one shot, I come in, I do a program, I leave, I never come again. It's really going to be annoying for you if you don't have a long-term commitment to navigate some of the structures there. But I would say if you stick at it, most of them are willing to open themselves to the community. But the community, I've experienced that the community will back away before they've kind of broken through that wall.
Yeah, and just to join in that, I think Dietra is absolutely right. in the long process that can deter people from really volunteering and engaging long term. And at Prison Fellowship, that's something that we face all the time in our adult prison ministry model. We also have a very long process to get volunteers approved and credentialed and all of those things to make them effective. And I think one thing that we have learned is that it's important to keep that communication open between yourself and the person who wants to volunteer, to make sure that that relationship and that channel is flowing, even as the more bureaucratic administrative channel may get stopped up, just so that you can do what you can to sort of feed the flame of their enthusiasm and their commitment to the issue, and be providing training and resources while they wait. And then second, I just think it's important to look for opportunities to partner with groups who are already doing this. So Dietra mentioned groups like Straight Ahead. There are people in most of these communities where you're working, who are effectively conducting ministry and doing visits in local detention centers and youth prisons. And if possible, I'd encourage you to tap those resources and ask them for their expertise on how to do that specifically with the system administrator in that area, because it can vary depending on where you're working. And then finally, I think there are also overlooked ministry opportunities in the community for kids who are on probation, for kids who are just coming back at that critical moment of deciding whether they're going to go back to the friend group that they had, the lifestyle that they had, the things that were not constructive for them, or whether they're really going to embrace this second chance. And I think the more that churches can get involved in that piece of supporting reentry for kids, the better success kids will have, the better outcomes, and then also the more demonstrable evidence communities will have to show that kids can be successful out of incarceration models and can be successful in the community when they have supports and accountability.